All right, so I've gotten a volunteer to let me open up their Snowperson scene, which is exactly what we wanted at the end of day one. And so I've got a copy of it here. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about using modifiers or modifying the. Wish I knew how to flip this so that right was left and left is right. It would make it easier for me. Nonetheless, there's got to be a way to do it. I'll figure it out later. Here I am looking at somebody else's work, and I started talking about how each of these arms is made from exactly what I told you to do, a simple cylinder. Now, a cylinder is like the round part of a pencil here. But in nature, if you pulled a branch out, it would probably have an effect like you see on the end of the pencil here. And the pencil starts out relatively thick and it gets narrower towards the bottom. Now, the names of the modifiers are intended to be self-descriptive. For example, there's a bend modifier, and it can do exactly what you think. It bends something. We'll show you that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about this one. Now, you might think narrower, skinnier. The word that they use is taper. It goes from either from a fatter end down to a skinny end, or you can actually use it by using a negative value to go from a smaller end up to a bigger end. We'll use taper later for other processes. But we're going to do it right now to change this cylinder on the arm. Now, before I move any further along, I want to maximize the viewport. As a reminder, in the lower right-hand corner over here, there's an icon I can use to maximize the current viewport. So this Snowperson scene will become full screen more or less. And the next thing I need to do when I'm going to use a modifier is decide what I'm going to change and then how I'm going to change it. So this is the cylinder, that's the arm. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using, see here it's backwards, I'm going to be using this area here called the modifier list. And I'm going to click in the drop down list. Now you can do two things. You can scroll down and look for the word taper, or you can touch the letter T on your keyboard and it'll pop right up to the top. So watch this as I click where the word goes, modifier list, and touch T, and it automatically finds the word taper. I have to click or press enter to apply that taper modifier. And now what we're going to do, if we look over here, is we've got the cylinder, and on top of the cylinder, we have an eyeball, which means it's visible. And we also have got something called taper that has that familiar triangle shape. That means you can open it up and look at more details. And below it, down over there, we've got some things called parameters that we can adjust for different effects. So working on the taper, not the cylinder now, but the taper. And I'm just going to briefly open this up to show you there's something called a gizmo. We have heard that word before, as well as the center. We're not going to move those right now, but they're accessible. What I am going to do is I'm going to go down to the amount. Now you can type in a value. So if I went in here and typed in 90 and hit enter, it's done a taper of 90. Looks like snowman wings almost. I didn't break anything. It looks dramatically different. That might be something you're going for. Actually, what I'm looking for is probably something like a -5. Maybe a -2. Now, instead of typing the numbers, and the reason I'm doing this is I want to point out that there's an easier way to do it. These little up-down arrows here can be used to change the value and watch it actually change. I can change my values by scrolling my mouse up and down with it selected until I visually see what I'm looking for. So now I've got the cylinders that where the arms have been tapered down. Jacob might like that, he might not like it, but it illustrates a point. Now, as I change one, the other one is changing. I can tell from that Jacob used instances, meaning that whatever you do to one of them, it's going to affect the other, as opposed to copies, where what you do to that one doesn't affect the other. So that's two different ways, and there's different reasons you'd want to do it. The one that's going to be different is either going to be a reference, like an evolved Pokemon, I guess, would be different than a standard Pokemon. Well, actually, a reference is probably more like a shiny. Yeah, that's more like a shiny, because it's got all the other attributes, but it's got one more on top of it. Or a dark, but enough about Pokemon. All right, so what I've done is I've added a taper here. Now I'm going to continue. I'm going to add another modifier, same process. I'm going to click in here and I want to add a a curve. And the word that we're looking for is bend, which I mentioned a minute ago. Now, bend does have properties as well as things you can get into, such as a gizmo and center. We're not going to mess with them. I just wanted to expose them to you to show you that they're available. Same is true of the cylinder. I can go down into the stack and look at the cylinder, and I can see currently there's 5 height segments. I'm going to come back to that in a minute and change it, and we'll see a dramatic effect on how bend works differently with more segments. But first, I'm going to, as I did with the taper, I'm going to just kind of rock back and forth with my mouse, and I can have them say, I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here is my handle, here is my spout. Are you rolling your eyes? You should be. All right, so we got this ability to bend as well as taper. Now, if I get it to a point where you see a little bit of strain, and this might be desirable, this polygonated look of it, what I want to demonstrate to you is if I go down in the stack, so instead of being on bend, look above my box where my head is here, instead of working on the bend, I'm going to come down and click on the word cylinder. Now the properties down here that I'm looking at are the ones that relate to the actual physical geometry down below. And as I increase the number of height segments, look how smooth it got. In fact, if I go down to 1 segment, bend has no effect at all. So just by changing one variable down below in the stack, you can have a dramatic effect. Now, that actually might look good if you have an interest in almost like an elbow look on your limbs, especially if you wanted to T-pose this guy and then animate him. Of course, you wouldn't have fingers. That gets more complicated. So this is an example of a setting you can play with. In fact, I can up the radius here so that he ends up with bigger arms. I can change his height so he ends up with longer arms. So by exposing these parameters and playing with them, you can end up with a variety of effects. Now, there is a smooth built into this. I'm going to turn smooth off, and I'm going to lower my number of segments to get a more polygonated feel here. Lower that to, there we go. Nice boxy polygonated feel. Because in addition to bend and taper, I'm going to show you one more modifier here called twist. So I'm going to click into the modifier, hit T like I did for taper, but I'm actually going to come down to something called twist. And as I change the value on twist, with the low polygon count, you can see the effect a little bit better. And you can give them almost Twizzler-like arms. So because there's more than one modifier, they're being interpreted in the order in the stack that they are. And by rearranging the order of the modifiers, by clicking and dragging, you can have a different effect very dramatically as well. For example, I'm going to move bend and move it below twist. And I end up with a radically different position. Position is affected by the other objects. So if I put tapes, look at that. I've ended up with 3 very different results on my arms just by rearranging the items in the stack. It's not at all what I want. I'm going to go back 2 changes using Control-Z, get back to where I was, and the twist was interesting to watch, but it doesn't really add a whole lot of value for my process here. So I'm going to roll that back and just give it a little bit of twist. And then if I move my twist around, it's hopefully not going to be quite as overwhelming of an effect. There we go. All of these settings can be played with. So what we're doing here is we're modifying a combination of the initial settings and the variables above to end up with different effects on the arms. So if we go back to what Jacob had originally, which was 2 straight arms, we've used modifiers to change them greatly. I'm going to pause the demo so that I can ask for questions and see what questions you might have. Hide that for a minute. You know what? That might actually be a good demo right there. So I'm going to stop this guy. to stop this demo. Screencast.